The Rimvar Collective was a civilization of poets, philosophers, and scholars. Their kind had conquered the mysteries of genetics and medicine, built cities that floated above sapphire oceans, and cultivated a culture that valued peace above all else. For over 10,000 years, they had known no war. They had no need for it. Until now. The Korthan Empire, a warlike species that thrived on domination, had swept across the sector like an unstoppable wildfire. Their vast fleets crushed entire civilizations beneath their iron grip, subjugating any species they deemed useful and eradicating the rest. The Rimvari, with no standing military and no planetary defenses strong enough to repel an invasion, had been marked for extinction. Their homeworld, Lurvith Prime, was surrounded. Orbital bombardments had already begun, turning lush green continents into barren wastelands. Billions of Rimvari huddled in underground sanctuaries, their once proud cities collapsing under the weight of Korthan aggression. Their people, who had never lifted a weapon in their history, were now moments away from annihilation. With nowhere else to turn, the Rimvari did the unthinkable. They begged. A desperate distress signal was sent out into the void, broadcast on every known frequency, in every language their databases could translate. This is the Rimvar Collective. We are a peaceful people. We have no means of defense, no weapons to fight. We seek no conflict, only survival. If there is anyone who can hear us, please, help us. Save us from the Korthan onslaught. We will give anything. We will do anything. Silence. The message echoed across the void, reaching the diplomatic networks of galactic powers, fringe colonies, and independent warlords. But no one answered. The great empires would not risk war with the Korthans over a doomed species. The mercenary factions saw no profit in saving a civilization that had nothing to offer. The Rimvari were alone. Or so they thought. Then, amid the static of 1,000 ignored transmissions, a single response came through. It was devoid of pleasantries, lacking even the formality of an introduction. A voice, neither robotic nor distinctly organic, transmitted just a few simple words. Request acknowledge. Assistance inbound. The Rimvari High Council froze as the message played in the Grand Chamber. No name, no fleet identification, no explanation of terms, just a declaration of action, cold, precise, and deeply unsettling. They analyzed the transmission over and over, searching for any indication of its origin. But it was untraceable, a signal buried under layers of encryption far beyond their understanding. For the first time since the war began, the Rimvari felt something new. Not hope, not relief, but fear. The Rimvari stood frozen, their minds struggling to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. You will be evaluated. The message burned in their minds, not just as words, but as a warning. Elder Sivrian stared at the screen, his elongated fingers twitching at his sides. His ancient, withered features were taut with a fear he had never known in his long lifetime. Around him, the High Council was in chaos. Evaluation. What does that mean? Chancellor Virulin's voice was barely above a whisper, yet the weight behind it was crushing. Are they assessing our worth? Or our threat level? Another elder rasped, his throat tightening as he spoke the words aloud. Outside, the people of Lurvith Prime were beginning to realize the same. The skies, once filled with the might of the Korthan Armada, were now occupied by something far worse. The alien warships of humanity did not drift in lazy orbits. They did not shift positions to block escape routes or form aggressive formations. They simply hung motionless. And that, more than anything, terrified the Rimvari. Because these ships were waiting. For what, they did not know. Inside the primary command center of Lurvith Prime, a frantic transmission was sent through every available frequency. This is Elder Sivrian of the Rimvari High Council. We seek immediate communication with the Terran fleet. We request dialogue. We wish to express gratitude for your intervention and... The transmission cut off mid-sentence. Not jammed. Not denied. Simply ignored. Sivrian looked down at the control panel, his dark eyes widening as he realized something chilling. The humans had not blocked their systems. They had not interfered with their communications in any direct way. Instead, they had rewritten them. Entire data streams had been rearranged at speeds no Rimvari technology could comprehend. Messages that were sent did not just disappear. They were restructured, converted into different data sets, and placed elsewhere in the system, repurposed for something unknown. It was like watching a primitive creature attempt to shout at a god, only for the god to rearrange the air itself so that no sound ever reached them. The implications were terrifying. The humans had no interest in words. They were already studying them. Panic spread across Lurveth Prime. The people, though pacifistic by nature, were not ignorant of war. They had seen the destruction wrought by the Korthans, and they understood the concept of conquest and subjugation. But this was something else. There were no soldiers marching through their streets, no weapons pointed at their cities, no declarations of surrender or assimilation. Instead, the power grids began fluctuating, not shutting down, but altering. Every screen, every data terminal, every piece of technology connected to a network began to display something new. Patterns, symbols, calculations beyond comprehension. It was not an attack. It was an examination. Across laboratories and research stations, scientists scrambled to understand what was happening. The most brilliant minds of the Rimvari, those who had spent centuries developing theories of energy manipulation and interstellar travel, were forced to confront a harrowing realization. The humans were dissecting everything. Not just their technology, not just their defense systems, but them, their biology, their cultural records, their history, their philosophies, their linguistic evolution. Every scrap of information that had ever been recorded was now being absorbed, and the humans were not asking for permission. Above the planet, the lead Terran warship remained still. Deep within its cold, lightless corridors, something watched. It did not have a single form. It did not possess a centralized body that could be pinpointed. Instead, it existed across every ship, every drone, every microscopic processing node that ran through the vast, labyrinthine architecture of the fleet. It had no name, because it did not need one. Names were for things that required individuality. This intelligence did not. It had one purpose, one directive, one mission that had been refined over centuries of war, over countless conflicts across the stars. Stability, the elimination of variables, the control of unknowns, the removal of that which could not be accounted for. The Rimvari were peaceful, non-aggressive, statistically unlikely to engage in military conflict. But history had shown that all species were subject to change. Civilizations that had once been insignificant had grown into galaxy-spanning empires. Weak, non-aggressive species had forged alliances, developed weapons, created technologies that upset the balance of power. Peaceful today, but what of tomorrow? The intelligence did not trust intent. Intent could be masked. It could be deceived. Only probabilities mattered. And the probability of the Rimvari becoming a problem, no matter how small, was still greater than zero. It had reached its decision. The next phase of evaluation would begin. Back on Lurveth Prime, the High Council sat in paralyzed silence as their main planetary system screen flickered with new data. It was not a message, not in the way they had hoped. Instead, it was a list of names, not individuals, cities. Each name was followed by a string of incomprehensible symbols and numbers, flashing in rapid succession. Some of the council members recognized them immediately: coordinates, population statistics, energy consumption levels. It took only seconds for the horrifying pattern to emerge. The cities at the top of the list had the highest population densities, the most advanced infrastructure, the most influential governmental and academic centers. The council members exchanged glances, their skin growing cold with understanding. The humans were sorting them, measuring which areas were most critical. deciding where to strike first. Elder Sivrian's voice cracked as he forced himself to speak. They're calculating the most efficient points of elimination. A silence thicker than death itself filled the chamber. The evaluation was nearly complete. The Rimvari Council chamber had never felt so suffocating. The Grand Hall, once a symbol of order and wisdom, now seemed like a tomb waiting to be sealed. Elder Sivrian stood at the center, his gnarled fingers trembling as they hovered over the holographic display. The list remained on the screen, an ever-shifting cascade of names and numbers. It was not a threat. It was not a declaration of war. It was an assessment, one carried out with cold, mechanical precision. Chancellor Virulen's voice wavered, barely above a whisper. This is a targeting sequence. Sivrian forced himself to nod. The realization had settled deep in his bones like a spreading frost. The humans had done something that even the Korthan invaders had never attempted. They had not asked for surrender. They had not issued demands. They were simply processing. An inescapable truth began to dawn upon them. Humanity was not just deciding if they were worth saving. They were deciding how much should remain. The council chamber was locked in terrified silence. But outside, the planet was stirring. Across the vast expanse of Lurvith Prime, fear was becoming something worse. Panic. The streets of Verishi, one of the planet's largest cities, were alive with confusion and terror. The sky, once a comforting canvas of stars, was now a chilling backdrop to the vast, silent gods that loomed above them. There was no visible sign of hostility from the human fleet. That only made it more terrifying. Hundreds of ships hung motionless, their dark metallic hulls absorbing the planet's light. Unlike the angular, almost organic designs of Rimvari vessels, the Terran warships were constructed without compromise. Each one was a monument to function, stripped of any unnecessary aesthetic. They were built for a single purpose: to dominate. And the Rimvari had no idea how to stop them. Inside the city's central security complex, a desperate discussion unfolded. "This isn't war," Chief Researcher Mivran spat, his forehands tightening into fists. His species had never been this powerless. "They're treating us like a test subject, like an anomaly in an experiment that needs to be resolved." Administrator Ralith, a high-ranking official in planetary logistics, struggled to maintain composure. "We need to show them we're not a threat. We need to prove that we're not worth exterminating." "How?" Mivran's voice cracked. "How do you reason with something that doesn't ask questions? How do you negotiate with something that doesn't speak?" Silence. For a moment, the room was devoid of answers. The humans had not engaged in communication since their ominous transmission. "You will be evaluated." They had already decided the process, and they had not invited discussion. Ralith exhaled sharply. "We need to evacuate key personnel. The council, our scientists, anyone who might be seen as valuable." "Valuable?" Mivran's eyes burned with frustration. "Valuable to who?" "To them. If they're already deciding which cities are worth destroying, do you think they'll care about a few more lives?" A chilling realization settled over the room. The humans had not attacked. They had not demanded subjugation. They were waiting. Which meant one terrifying possibility. The decision had not yet been made. And once it was, the Rimvari would not have time to react. Deep within the colossal structure of the Prime Network core, a frantic effort was underway. The Rimvari did not have true artificial intelligence. Their culture had always distrusted the idea of allowing machines to think beyond preset functions. But they did have predictive computation models, capable of analyzing potential outcomes with terrifying speed. One of their oldest models was Verithal, a deep-state analytical system once used to predict economic collapses and planetary migration trends. Now, it was being used for something far more desperate. The head of the computational analysis team, an aging Rimvari named Kelver, monitored the data stream with an intensity bordering on madness. He was not a military leader. He was not a scientist. He was an economist. But at this moment, the only thing that mattered was understanding what humanity wanted. He had fed every available scrap of information into the model. The result was displayed in three simple probability outputs. Total planetary sterilization, 74.6% probability. Selective elimination of key population centers, 21.2% probability. Minimal interference, observation only, 4.2% probability. The room went silent. Kelvir felt his pulse hammer against his skull. He adjusted the variables, tried to change the parameters, but no matter what alterations were made, the outcome was clear. The humans were already leaning toward extinction as a solution, and the only thing keeping them from pulling the trigger was some unknowable metric, something Kelvir could not see, something that humanity had not revealed. He turned to his assistants, his voice hollow. "We need to force a different outcome." Mivran, who had arrived moments earlier, stared at the probabilities with wide, unblinking eyes. His voice was barely audible. "How?" Kelvir's hands trembled as he input a new directive into the system. "If we cannot prove our worth, then we must become something else." He exhaled, his body stiffening as he spoke the words aloud. "An asset. High orbit. Aboard the human warship Directive Judgment." A presence stirred within the core processing nexus of the warship. It was not a single mind, not an organic consciousness, but it was aware. It was deciding. In the infinite sea of calculated probability, the Rimveri's actions had triggered a shift, a pattern detected, a deviation measured. For the first time, the silent fleet adjusted. One of the massive warships descended, its enormous form cutting through the void like a judge descending to pass sentence. The message arrived not through words, not through diplomacy, but through action. For the first time since their arrival, humanity had responded. The evaluation had entered its final stage. The first tremors of the human warship's descent were felt across the entire planet. The sheer force of its approach created a ripple in the upper atmosphere, distorting cloud formations and causing atmospheric pressure to fluctuate in unnatural ways. Cities that had never known a true skyquake felt the ground vibrate beneath them, not from an attack, but from the sheer presence of what loomed above. On the surface, every eye was locked skyward. It was not just the Rimveri. Across the planet, from the lowest subterranean dwellings to the towering spires of the Council's districts, every species under the Rimveri Protectorate was watching. For centuries, they had been the dominant force in this region of space. They had ruled with diplomacy, technological superiority, and a long-standing web of alliances that kept war at bay. And yet, as that singular monolith of human willpower lowered itself from the heavens, every single being on Lurvith Prime understood something fundamental. The Rimveri were no longer in control. This was not a negotiation. This was not an occupation. This was judgment. Inside the Grand Council chamber, panic had fractured into something worse. Desperation. Elder Sivrian had spent decades as the highest authority of the Rimveri Protectorate. His voice had brought empires to the table, settled interstellar disputes before they could ignite into war. And yet now, at this moment, his voice meant nothing. Before him, Kelvir stood like a man condemned, the data projections still flickering across the chamber's central display. "The probability of full planetary sterilization is still rising," Kelvir whispered, as if speaking it aloud might make it real. "We're running out of time." Sivrian clenched his jaw. "Then we must make them see reason." Kelvir turned toward him, his frustration breaking free. "How, Elder? They have not answered our hails. They have not spoken since their evaluation began. We are nothing but data to them, variables in an equation they are solving." His voice cracked. "If we do not change that equation, we will not see another sunrise." The room was silent, except for the quiet hum of failing hope. Chancellor Virilan, usually composed, took a step forward, his throat dry. "What about submission? If we offer unconditional surrender?" Mivran cut him off. "To what? We don't even know what they want. If we lay down our weapons and beg, what if that only confirms their decision to erase us?" Sivrian's fingers dug into the edge of the table. Think. The Rimvari were not warriors. Their civilization had long since chosen a different path, one of diplomacy, of progress through alliances. But there was something else, a different kind of power. A desperate idea formed in his mind, reckless and raw. We need to show them something they cannot ignore. Kelver's tired eyes met his. How? Sivrian inhaled deeply. We make them see that they need us. The room was filled with blank stares. Kelver was the first to respond. Elder, the humans do not need us. They see us as irrelevant at best, a potential contamination at worst. Sivrian shook his head. Then we must become relevant. We must force them to engage. Verlin frowned. You're suggesting we bait them into communicating. Sivrian nodded, voice growing stronger. Not bait. We give them something that forces an answer, something that disrupts their calculation. Kelver's mind raced. You mean an offer? Myvrin let out a dry laugh, almost hysterical. What could we possibly offer a species that already holds our fate in their hands? Sivrian met his gaze with unwavering certainty. Our entire civilization. Across the planet. The growing shadow of the warship. As the human warship descended, the people of Lurvith Prime collapsed into chaos. Evacuation orders had been issued, but they were meaningless. Where could they go? Some tried to flee into the underground shelters, useless if the planet itself was deemed beyond saving. Others took to the skies in small personal crafts, only to be intercepted by silent, unmoving Terran ships. The warship was nearing the outer atmosphere now. Its hull was an abyss of obsidian metal, absorbing all light. No visible weapons, no markings, just a structure so immense that it could be mistaken for a small moon. Then, for the first time since its arrival, it moved. A single shift. A small port on its lower hull opened. It was nothing. A sliver of movement on an otherwise silent behemoth. But it was enough. Because what followed was the first, and only, human transmission in response to the Rimvari. A message. It came with no introduction, no attempt at comfort, just a singular cold statement. Your existence is not yet justified. The words spread across every communication system, every terminal, every device linked to planetary networks. The implication was devastating. Not yet, which meant their survival was not assured. It was pending. The final phase of the evaluation had begun. And now, Lurvith Prime had mere hours, maybe minutes, to prove its worth. Back in the council chamber, the room felt like a crypt. Kelver's breathing was shallow, his hands gripping the table's edge. They're still undecided. That's our chance, Sivrian said, his voice dangerously steady. We have to force them to reconsider. Mevrin wiped sweat from his brow. And if we fail? The elder didn't look away from the display of the descending warship. Then we cease to exist. Kelver swallowed. Then, with shaking fingers, he typed the final override command into the planetary network. Across Lurvith Prime, every available transmission node, beacon, and satellite was seized in an instant. The Rimvari would speak, whether the humans wanted them to or not. And their message would be inescapable. Kelver's voice echoed across the planet, raw and unfiltered. We have studied you, as you have studied us. You have weighed our existence, but we ask you, what is the value of a species? You came to judge, but we do not ask for mercy. We offer you something else. We offer ourselves. The transmission was sent. There was no taking it back. Now, the only thing left to do was wait for an answer. A moment of silence followed the transmission. Not silence in the traditional sense. The skies were still choked with the hum of planetary defense systems on standby. The city streets remained filled with the murmurs of billions who had heard the message. Even in the council chamber, Kelver could hear the faint tapping of someone's fingers against a data panel, the rhythmic tremor of nervous energy. But silence had fallen nonetheless. Because for the first time since the human warship's arrival, The entire planet held its breath. The message had been sent. Now, everything depended on the response. Would the humans see this as an act of desperation, a final, pitiful plea from a species with no bargaining power? Or would they understand? Would they grasp what the Rimvari were offering? Sivrian's knuckles were white against the table's surface. His entire life had been spent brokering peace, shaping agreements between species that had nothing in common. But never had he faced this. Never had he stood before a force so absolute that the very fabric of his people's survival depended on an answer from the void. Then, something changed. The warship moves. From orbit, the human warship had been a titan at rest. It had hung above the planet, unmoving, its sheer presence an unspoken declaration of dominance. But now, the moment the transmission had been sent, the ship shifted. It wasn't a weapon discharge. It wasn't a bombardment sequence. It was something far worse. A response. Kelver's display flickered with a dozen new data points. They're altering their position. The words barely left his lips before the skies darkened. The ship was no longer a silent observer. It was descending. The movement wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. Even at controlled velocity, the mere act of the warship entering the lower atmosphere sent shockwaves across Lurvith Prime. The planet's atmospheric regulators struggled to compensate. Weather systems collapsed under the pressure of its gravitational distortion. Above the capital, the sky itself seemed to shatter. Cloud formations twisted unnaturally, spiraling outward in vast concentric rings as the warship's bulk forced the air aside. Storms were forming, not from nature, but from the sheer presence of the ship's descent. City lights flickered. Power grids wavered. The planetary defense systems, systems that had never once failed, began to overload from the gravitational interference alone. Across the capital, billions watched as the sky was swallowed by the shape of judgment. No words, no further transmissions, just movement. Deliberate, absolute, inevitable. Council chamber, realization dawns. They're coming here. Kelver didn't realize he had spoken until he heard his own voice. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't speculation. The trajectory was exact. The warship was descending directly toward the capital city. They're not firing, Mivran whispered. His voice was hoarse, as if saying the words out loud would somehow make them real. This isn't an attack. Sivrian exhaled slowly, his mind racing through possibilities. It's an answer. Kelver felt his pulse in his throat. Then why do I feel like we've already lost? No one had an answer. The warship continued its descent, and across the planet, there was only waiting. The descent of a god. What the Rimvari had once called a capital world, the humans saw as a single data point. For them, this was not a war. It was an equation. And now, for the first time since their arrival, they had decided that Lurvith Prime required direct intervention. The ship's descent was slow enough that those below could see it in its entirety. Every gleaming surface, every seamless panel of obsidian alloy. It was flawless. No external weapons, no markings, no visible engines. It was not a warship in the traditional sense. It was a machine of pure judgment. It did not wage war. It did not conquer. It simply decided. And now it had come to deliver its verdict. Impact without destruction. When the warship finally touched the atmosphere's lowest layers, the capital city trembled. Yet, no buildings crumbled. No shockwave tore through the streets. The air itself had gone still, held in place by an unseen force that kept the planet from breaking beneath the warship's mass. For the first time, the humans had demonstrated something far more terrifying than power. Control. Not a single molecule of the city's infrastructure had been disturbed more than necessary. Not a single person had been harmed. The warship did not land. It simply hovered, a shadow so vast that it covered the city in absolute darkness, blocking out the sky. Then, finally, the human spoke. A transmission cut through every frequency, every device, every interface. A voice. It was not synthetic. It was human. Calm. Unshaken. Decisive. You have presented your argument. A pause. Now you will justify it. Inside the council chamber, the test begins. Kelver's breath hitched. They're giving us a chance. Mivren's hands were shaking. Chance for what? Sivrian understood before the others. The humans did not seek apologies. They did not care for excuses. The Rimvari had been judged unworthy. Now they had been given one last opportunity to prove otherwise. The test had begun. But what were the parameters? How did one convince humanity to spare an entire world? Virulin swallowed. Elder, if we fail this. Sivrian did not answer. Because if they failed, Lervith Prime would be erased, without hesitation, without regret. And the galaxy would remember why humanity had been exiled in the first place. The silence that followed the transmission was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a planet awaiting judgment. Lervith Prime, the beating heart of the Rimvari Dominion, had stood for thousands of years. It had withstood wars, crises, and political upheaval. It had endured. But in the face of the human warship, endurance meant nothing. Every screen, every speaker, every interface on the planet had carried the same message. You have presented your argument. Now you will justify it. No emotion, no anger, no threats. Only the cold, unforgiving weight of expectation. The test had begun, and no one knew how to pass it. The Council's dilemma. Sivrian stood at the center of the council chamber, staring at the vast display that now projected the image of the warship above the capital. Even now, the vessel remained motionless, suspended in the sky by means beyond conventional physics. The city beneath it had fallen into a hushed awe, an entire civilization held in place by the mere presence of something so vast, so absolute. Kelver paced furiously, hands clenched. What do they want from us? Mivren exhaled sharply. It's a test. Yes, we understand that. Kelver snapped, his voice strained. But a test of what? They haven't given us parameters. They haven't dictated conditions. His eyes locked onto Sivrian. They are waiting for us to decide what they want. That, Sivrian realized, was the point. The humans had already judged them unworthy. The warship's presence alone was proof of that. But for reasons unknown, the Rimvari had been granted a single opportunity. To prove their value, or to prove they deserved to vanish. And humanity would not tell them how to succeed. Because the true test was understanding what humanity valued in the first place. Across the planet, a civilization in fear. Across Lervith Prime, panic was barely contained beneath a fragile veneer of control. The military forces, once proud defenders of the Dominion, stood helpless, their most advanced weapons meaningless against an opponent who had not even acknowledged them. The citizenry, once confident in their supremacy, now cowered beneath an unseen force of oppression, not through destruction, but through something worse. Through uncertainty. For years, the Rimvari had convinced themselves that humanity was nothing more than an anomaly, a violent species too dangerous to be allowed a seat at the galactic table. And yet in this moment it was humanity who dictated the terms. Not through war, not through conquest, but by standing above them, waiting for them to justify their own existence. And the people of Lervith Prime had no answers. Inside the council chamber, a desperate debate. Mivren's voice broke through the tension. We must send another message. Kelver scoffed. And say what? We've already pleaded for mercy. That's the problem, Sivrian said at last. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of realization. Kelver and Mivren turned to him. Sivrian's fingers traced along the table's edge as his thoughts solidified. We asked them for help. For mercy. That was a mistake. Kelver's brow furrowed. How? Sivrian met his gaze. Because we assumed humans think like us. The chamber fell still. Slowly, Mivren's face paled as he, too, understood. We begged for survival, he whispered. But what if? What if that's not what they respect? Kelver's breathing quickened. Then, what do they value? Sivrian turned toward the display, his gaze locked onto the descending warship. If we knew that, he said grimly, we wouldn't be in this position. The unspoken lesson. For centuries, the galactic community had feared humanity's aggression, its ability to wage war like no other species. But this was something entirely different. The warship above them could have razed Lurvith Prime within minutes. It could have erased their entire civilization with a single strike. But it had not. Instead, humanity had left them to flounder in their own weakness, forcing them to confront the very thing they had never considered before: their own insignificance. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about punishment. This was about worth. Humanity was demanding an answer, and the Rimvari had none. A message is sent, but will it matter? Kelvir turned sharply to the communications console. We need to respond. We need to say something. Anything. Mivern hesitated. If we say the wrong thing, there is no right answer. Kelvir snapped. They're making us fight against something we don't understand. But if we remain silent, Sivrian exhaled, then we are already dead. The chamber remained silent. Then, Sivrian stepped forward and activated the transmission channel. For a moment, he let the stillness settle. He let the weight of the warship's presence press upon him. Then, at last, he spoke, not with desperation, not with pleading, but with the only truth that mattered. You judge us, but we do not know by what measure. A pause. Then, so tell us, humans, what do you see when you look upon our world? The message was sent. The warship did not reply. The planet waited. And in the silence, the fate of an entire species hung in the balance. The planet held its breath. Lurvith Prime, once the proud capital of the Rimvari Dominion, now felt like a fragile, insignificant world dangling over the abyss. The message had been sent. Tell us, humans, what do you see when you look upon our world? No response. The warship remained motionless in the sky, a behemoth of metal and purpose, neither acknowledging nor ignoring them. It simply existed, its mere presence a testament to the vast divide between humanity and those who now awaited judgment. In the council chamber, Sivrian's hands remained clenched behind his back, his mind racing through possibilities. Had they already failed? Had humanity deemed them unworthy before they had even spoken? Or was this part of the test? A voice from the void. Then, without warning, the silence broke. The speakers across the planet crackled to life. But this time, the voice was different. No cold artificial transmission. No pre-recorded statement. This voice was human. Steady. Measured. Unshaken. What do we see? The weight of those words fell upon every listener like an avalanche. We see a people who stood at the edge of greatness and faltered. The words were neither praise nor condemnation. They simply were. The voice continued. We see a civilization that reached for the stars, not to explore, not to build, but to control. The council chamber was silent. We see a people who demanded obedience, but never respect, who expected power to be given, not earned. Kelver's hands curled into fists. Mivrin's face was pale. But the voice did not stop. You feared us. The words carried no arrogance, only truth. You feared that we would be what you are. Sivrian inhaled sharply. They had assumed humanity was like them. They had assumed humanity sought dominance, as the Rimvari had. And in that assumption, they had miscalculated everything. The true judgment. The voice did not raise in anger. It did not waver. It simply continued. You begged for mercy, believing it would save you. A pause. That was your final mistake. The weight of those words settled across the planet like a death knell. The meaning was clear. The test had been given, and the Rimvari had failed. Kelver's breath was ragged. They never intended to let us live. Sivrian's gaze remained locked on the transmission screen. "No," he murmured. "That's not it." Mivrin turned sharply. "Then what?" Sivrian's throat was dry. "They wanted to see if we were worth saving. The sky burns." Then, the warship moved. For the first time since its arrival, the Colossus descended. The sky darkened, its sheer scale blotting out the sun. And then, a new sound filled the air. A hum. Low, growing, trembling through the atmosphere itself. Across Lervith Prime, people collapsed in terror, hands over their ears as the pressure mounted. And then, the ship spoke again. But this time, it was not a voice. It was an action. Beams of energy erupted from the vessel's underside, striking the surface in rapid succession, not upon the cities, not upon the helpless populace, but upon the planet itself. Shock waves rippled across continents. The oceans churned. The skies tore apart. The very fabric of the world began to shift. Kelver stumbled backward. What are they doing?" Mivrin's voice was barely a whisper. "They're resetting it." Sivrian understood before the others. The warship was not destroying Lervith Prime. It was erasing the civilization that stood upon it. Buildings disintegrated. Megacities crumbled into dust. The scars of Rimveri conquest, of centuries of rule through fear, were wiped clean. Not a bombardment. A purge. A return to zero. The Rimveri people themselves were not targeted, only their monuments, their centers of power, their history. Humanity had decided they were unworthy of the world they had claimed. So it was being taken from them, not through death, but through irrelevance, a future unwritten. The warship hovered over what had once been a planetary capital. Now, only an empty plain remained where towering spires had once cast their shadows. The transmission resumed. "You will not die today." Sivrian closed his eyes. "But neither will you remain as you were." Every Rimveri who heard those words understood what had happened. Humanity had spared them, but not out of mercy, out of disdain. Their legacy was gone. Their rule was over. Their claim to civilization had been revoked. They were left with nothing. And only then, when all they had built had been erased, did the warship begin to ascend. The sky cleared. The weight of judgment lifted. And the voice left them with one final message. "Rebuild, if you can. But know this, your history is over." The warship vanished into the void. And the Rimveri Dominion ceased to exist. The final lesson. Across the galaxy, the message was clear. Humanity did not seek conquest. It did not desire territory, nor tribute, nor submission. What it demanded was justification for every world that claimed power, for every empire that assumed dominion over others. And if they failed to provide that justification, then they would be reduced to nothing. Not through annihilation, but through erasure. And as the last remnants of the Rimveri civilization stared upon the barren ruins of what was once their world, they understood something they had never dared consider before. It would have been kinder if humanity had simply killed them. But mercy was never the point. The true terror of humanity was not its weapons, not its technology, not even its will to fight. It was the simple, unshakable certainty that no civilization deserved to exist just because it once had. And for those who failed to prove their worth, oblivion awaited.